Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action. Hi, everyone. Today I'm sitting here with Carmen, who is coming to talk to us about a lot of interesting things that are going down in the States. So, as you know, I'm based in Toronto, but Carmen has a totally different perspective. Hi, Carmen.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
How are
How
you?
are you? I'm so good. I'm so happy that you're here. Yes. Okay. So I'm super excited for our audience to get to know you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a bit. What can you tell us about yourself for the audience who might not know you just yet?
Sure.
Sure.
So
So,
I am the CEO and president of the Women's Foundation of the South, which is the first public charity of its kind in the United States, in that we were founded by grant makers who are women of color and allies, expressly to center the lives of women and girls of color in the U.S. South. So our focus are the 13 states of the U.S. South and building health, wealth, and power for women and girls of color in the South. We exist because we understand that women and girls of color receive the smallest share of philanthropic investment in the US. And we are seeking to change that trend. We understand, especially nonprofits that serve women and girls of color, they're doing the most critical work in our communities of this time, and doing that work under resource or severely under resource has extreme consequences. So I'm a grant maker by trade. I've been so for 26 plus years, and this is the thing that I love the most.
I think the focus that you have is so well needed and it can basically only come from the community. So, by community for community, which is really nice. But since I'm not an American, maybe our American audience will know, but what is the big difference when it comes to the funding and the approach to philanthropy in the North and the South of the United States?
I think that often the South is not considered as an area of priority and focus. And that's been the case for a couple of decades, actually. And when it comes to the issues that pertain to women and girls of color, yes, I do think that the lack of prioritization of the South, combined with just the impacts of racism over time and also patriarchy, that those issues are not prioritized in the South. And at the same time, we have the South being one of the most dynamically growing regions in the US. You have not only an incredible increase in immigration and immigrants settling in the South, but you also have large numbers of African Americans who are making the reverse migration from the North to the South and returning to Southern communities, actually, like I did. I'm a granddaughter of the South. My grandparents came from, on both sides, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. So I have actually, since completing high school in Pennsylvania, have been moving further and further to the south and now in Louisiana. So this is a trend actually that we're seeing, and more than 50% of the US's population that are people of color now live in the South, and that number is growing.
Wow, that's a huge stat. As someone who is a grant maker, you probably talk to your grantees quite a bit.
Mhm.
What kind of challenges are they telling you they're facing?
Well, that's actually a very big question. So we opened our doors in August 2021, and in 3 years we've been expanding our programmatic work state by state. We've been very thoughtful and engaging leaders on the ground so that we can get to know them, know their communities, and understand the problems and challenges that they face that are unique to their community, as well as those that are shared among other leaders in the South. So we are currently in 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia. We're currently expanding our work to Arkansas, and next year plan to be in Alabama and Tennessee. So those are the first 7 states of our ground game, so to speak. What we're hearing when we're speaking to nonprofit leaders who are working on the ground about how they're supported, what challenges they're seeing. One, we were hearing from nonprofits that often their work is overlooked or their abilities as leaders are underestimated. They're seen as having a severe lack of capacity to do the work. So often they have, especially when getting support from larger funders, are told that they have to be validated, so to speak, or verified or vouched for by larger, more mainstream or white-led nonprofits. Often they're told to partner with other entities, and if the funding does get to them, it's pretty small, and because it's been dispersed between many different partners. And I would say that it's just tough. So I've met nonprofit leaders here in the South who are women of color who have liquidated their retirements to support their organizations. Leaders who are not able to provide health insurance for their staff, and they also do not have health insurance. So those are some of the challenges, I would just say, writ large, for some of the organizations that are particularly led by women of color in the South or serving women and girls of color in the South. Beyond that, I would say the repeal of affirmative action has created an environment fear and also of just a lack of understanding. We did a lunch and learn with our grantees just about 2 weeks ago, and we invited folks who are doing work in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as a woman who is doing research looking at philanthropic trends in the US given the repeal of affirmative action. And then also we had a legal team that we've worked with from Crowell and Mooring join our call to answer questions from grantees and to talk about this landscape. And one of the lawyers said that this has created an environment where there's a boogeyman. And some of the fear that is being put forward, given some of the lawsuits that have happened, it's really not fully justified. But even though legally it might not be fully justified in all cases for nonprofits and for work in this sector, it is the perception of whether or not it is justified, whether or not this work is legal, whether the work that groups are doing is fair, so on and so forth, that is causing an overall retrenchment in support. One of the things that our grantees said to us is that in this moment, many of them are experiencing local funders. And in the words of one of our grantees, she said, local funders are not showing up for us. So if you're doing work, for instance, providing food, providing housing, addressing food security or housing insecurity, or providing mental health services, or doula or midwife services, the people who you are serving are the most marginalized or the most disenfranchised or who haven't received those supports and benefits. Um, and those people happen to be Black people, brown people, immigrants, and Native people. Somehow that work is being translated into being unjust or unfair. And yet, those communities, those populations have not been made whole in any shape or form. They have not been made whole, meaning they're not yet at parity with their white counterparts. And our communities are suffering. And so in the face of these legal challenges, what's missing from this is how to correct the fact that these communities are still very much struggling and at a position of not being at parity in terms of the resources that are available to them.
A lot of what you're talking about actually echoes a discussion that I had with Marissa DeSales, who is in California. She's a
Mhm.
Black fundraiser that leads cohorts of Black fundraisers and women of color fundraisers um, in the space. A lot of the issues are very similar, which is so disheartening and so upsetting. But I wanted to touch a little bit about something that you said about the lawsuits, because that's something that hasn't started in Canada just yet, but it's something that I'm keeping a close eye on in the States, where people are seeing it as unjust to only focus on the most marginalized groups. Like, why are you not including the most privileged groups in your programming or in your funding? Are you worried about that as a granting organization? Have you seen other grantors pull back significantly because of that? Can you talk a little bit about the lawsuits?
Sure. The case that has drawn incredible attention since the repeal of affirmative action has been the lawsuit against the Fearless Fund. And the Fearless Fund has focused on providing support to Black women entrepreneurs in the country. So, just some background in terms of Black women entrepreneurs in the US typically receive less than 2% of venture capital dollars for their businesses. So, this issue of lack of access to capital has been a significant issue that has impacted Black female entrepreneurs. And the Fearless Fund has sought as a remedy or as a way of supporting Black women businesses, has created programs to help support founders. And the one effort that they have had to invest in Black women's businesses has been through uh, a competition where Black women founders can apply for the opportunity to receive a $25,000 investment in their business. So they were confronted unexpectedly soon after the Supreme Court decision here in the US, which, let's be clear, that decision was based on a university and pertaining to students having equal admission to universities without any preference or privilege. A decision that regarded university admission and the law, the 1918 law that was used to challenge that, was a law that looked at preferential treatment in the awarding of contracts. I'm not a legal expert. I'm not the one who should be going into deep legal ease or explanation of this, but as I understand it, the issue has been, or that has been held up, is the fact that the Fearless Fund's work was seen as an open competition, that people were applying for, and there's question as to whether or not that law can apply versus as a grant maker, as a funder, as an investor, using those investments and funds and gifts as a part of our First Amendment right to freedom of speech, and looking at grant making as a part of that. In no way do I or others support this action against the Fearless Fund, because they are trying to remedy a very serious issue, and that is that African American women founders are not resourced at the level of their male counterparts or white counterparts. And so we'll see where this court case will go. But recently there was an 11th Circuit Court decision that they cannot make grants until this comes to a further conclusion. But there have been other lawsuits that have challenged supports to women of color, especially Black women. With Progressive Insurance, there was a suit to challenge a program that they have called Hello Alice, which made it possible for Black women to purchase vehicles for their businesses and have those insured. And the suits that are being brought against Progressive, against the Fearless Fund, and there was another case in California, is that for those entities to prioritize Black women was reverse discrimination. For, in the case of Progressive, for a white man who thought that he should be able to apply for those supports, and to others. So that is just the nature of some of the cases as I understand it. The Progressive Insurance case did not move forward. It did not, it failed. The Fearless Funds case is still ongoing. And there are others where the threat of litigation is looming. I can say that what WFS has done, we have used this as an opportunity to make sure that we have general counsel on board. We were brought on as a client of LCCR, and we had a legal review done of all of our external facing documents, of our grant program, of all of our grant documents, of our mission, the whole nine, to determine what our risk of litigation was, and if we are litigated, what defense and what things we would have, where we would be vulnerable and where we would be strong. This approach of doing a legal review is something that we are recommending for any and all nonprofits if they suspect that they are at risk for litigation, because as you can imagine, it's an unanticipated cost and expense, and it's not a low cost at all. And many nonprofits could not afford to do it. We certainly would not have been able to do it if we did not have pro bono support. So that is an avenue that I certainly recommend that nonprofits consider, as well as there are funders who are putting together legal defense funds. So one thing that we've been looking at is all of the insurance that we carry as an entity, what our levels of insurance are we adequately insured, and what needs we might have for a legal defense fund.
It's wild to see how people are trying to weaponize the system even more against racialized people. It's already not in our favor. So to have it feels like being kicked when you're already down. And it also points to a sense of entitlement that I see. And you were saying, like, this white man, no, I need those extra $2 in my pocket. You cannot, I have $98 and I want your two, which is just so horrible to see. It seems like from the examples you gave, the nonprofits that are being sued or being sought injunctions against are mostly led by people of color, which is also interesting because so many nonprofits serve people of color. Are you seeing lawsuits towards white led organizations that serve people of color, or is it just people of color led organizations serving people of color?
I really do not know the answer to that. I can tell you that in the case of Progressive Insurance, which is a corporation here in the US, so certainly not a black corporation. And one of the things that the lawyers pointed out to us is that where these suits are happening, and the level of legal support that the companies or the group that is being sued has, we're seeing different outcomes. I would say that there's a difference in terms of where these suits are taking place and then what the outcome is in terms of the courts that they're going through.
And do you see this as an opportunity for organizations to do donor education, or is it better to leave it until you have to? Like I'm assuming a lot of organizations are already connecting with donors who have shared values, but I wonder if it's a good opportunity to preemptively talk about there's these cases going on. This is a really an important moment for us. We really need you to stand with your commitments. What do you think about that?
I do. I do think this is a moment to be talking to donors. And for instance, this is a moment to be proactive, to reach out to, if you're talking about philanthropic institutions, this is a moment to reach out to your program officer, to the folks who you are connected to, and share with them what's happening, what you are experiencing, and to see about future commitments from them to help you through these moments and to help your organization in the future. There are some funders that have graciously in this moment stepped up and are providing more operating support or even multi-year commitments to organizations, understanding that this isn't just a fluke, that this is a real moment that will be with us for a moment or for some period of time. And they're making sure that nonprofits are being able to withstand these shocks that are coming as a result of the repeal of affirmative action and just how different funding entities are taking it. So I think this is a moment to be proactive, to engage your funders, to engage your donors, your individual donors, to ask them to step up and to stand in the gap. And just so much as it is a moment for those things, some of the things that we talked about in our Lunch and Learn with our grantees, that this is also a moment for us to look at diversifying our funding sources. So if a nonprofit was heavily reliant on foundation support or public support. We have some southern states that have said if you do any work related to DE&I, you can no longer receive state dollars. We have some nonprofits that have to weigh the loss of state support in what they do and how they talk about their work. This is a moment where we have to look at diversifying our sources of support and how we engage donors, or how do we factor in earned revenue into our mix of where our dollars come from. So we talked quite a bit about that. And the other thing that we talked about was how just like some funders can be single issue focused, where they are health focused and you are going after this funder because they are health focused and you provide a health related service or benefit. We talked about looking at the work holistically and also seeing what other areas might apply to your work. Would there be an implication, for instance, if you're health focused, to also, if you looked at climate and climate justice and how those things are connected? So that, for instance, if you had XYZ funder who has pulled back, but if you look at the climate related elements of your work, you might be able to approach new or different funders for that part of your work. So we talked about looking at our work more broadly, and we understand, especially as it comes to women of color, our work is so deeply intersectional. So we have, for instance, reproductive justice funders who are also providing food and supplies for seniors and or children. So how do you talk about those other elements of your work and make sure that you're getting support for all of what you're doing?
Ah, thanks so much for saying that. I have a colleague who works in an organization locally that does like advocacy around biking and like having an
Mm,
accessible city that isn't just like very transit heavy. And she was telling me like, "Oh, I debut on health, like Health Canada, and I talk about the health benefits of riding a bike, and I also talk about the benefits to our transportation systems as in urban planning and all that stuff." So just looking at your work through these different lenses and like the benefits that you give really opens you up to that revenue diversification and ensures that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket.
exactly. Exactly.
Talking about the lawsuits and this kind of thing that's going on also makes me think a little bit about what other organizations should be thinking about this. For example, should the YWCA be thinking about this if they're doing gender based programming as a protected ground, right? Or any disability based programming be thinking about this? Do you think people will turn around and be like, oh, I'm a man and I want to be in that program, or I don't have a disability and I want to be in that program and it's a protected ground? Or are we only seeing this with racialized people as the protected ground that's being under attack?
It's racialized, certainly. The 1918 law has nothing to do with gender, disabilities, or so on and so forth. It truly is the element of race.
It's just horrible. I don't know, like where do we go from here basically? We already have communities that are forced to be resilient. They're doing the most that they can do for their own communities, which are often neglected. There is a lot of advocacy, I feel, in a lot of organizations, but how do we actually move the needle on some of these louder voices?
There are those who say, I mean, let's understand that in the US in particular, there's been incredible progress that has been made, certainly in the course of my lifetime. I was born the very year that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. In the course of my lifetime, there have been incredible strides that have been made. And yet, at the same time, with progress, we've often seen backlash and the fear of that progress and the desire to take things back, to be regressive. And certainly, we've had regressive policies that have been passed across the South in a number of different areas. The issue is this is a time where people have to understand that the progress that has been made has been real. And the way that we maintain that progress is to be involved, to be engaged, to know that your voice matters, your vote matters, your support matters. And this is a time where so much is at stake. It utterly baffles me that I am living at a time where my daughter has fewer rights than I had when I was her age and navigating being a young woman. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we leaving for not just our children and our children's children, but their children? So we have to have a long game in mind because the things that are being carried out now have been carried out definitely. They've been planned over a period of time and definitely with the long game in mind. And So to me, this is a moment for us to stick true to our mission, to stay the course, stay true to the work, and to know that this is a moment where we cannot afford to be asleep at the wheel, so to speak.
I think you're totally right. The backlash means that we're doing something right.
Mhm.
Carmen, is there anything else that you want to leave our audience with today?
I will say that we are thrilled to be working on our second Shift the South report. The first Shift the South report can be found on our website, and I encourage your listeners to visit our website at www.womensfoundationsouth.org and sign up for our newsletter. Stay in touch, stay engaged with us. But on our website, our first Shift the South report was essentially a report card. It looked at all 13 US states and presented information on how women of color were faring in those states along indicators of health, um, protection under the law, as well as economic security. And as you might be able to imagine, all 13 states are performing below the national average in these areas. So this Shift the South report is going a little bit deeper. We're not only looking at data and indicators in terms of how women and girls of color are faring in the South, but we're also looking at the policy conditions that shape the ways in which they're living their lives. And affirmative action, of course, is a big part of that, but there are other policy decisions and policy um, implications that deeply impact the lives of all people in the South, and particularly women and families of color. For instance, this report focuses on the 7 states of our ground game that I mentioned earlier. And of those 7 states, 5 of them elected not to expand Medicaid. And this non expansion of Medicaid, not providing insurance for people who are in the gap, who make too much money for Medicaid and too little money for private insurance. I've been told this is one of the largest healthcare issues and represents one of the most significant crises of care in our community, period, hands down. Um, we also look at, for instance, how different things are connected, like lack of comprehensive sex education, lack of access to prenatal care and birthing services and supports, and also high mortality rates among women who are pregnant and lack of access to healthy or health related abortion when needed. All these things are connected and interconnected. So that report will be released on Women's Equality Day, which is August 26th. And we're excited to be presenting this frame. Our data partners have included folks from the Women's Funding Network in partnership with the Institute for Women's Policy Research, Tulane University, and the ACLU. This data it's not easy to find disaggregated data on the South. And this has been quite a labor given the policy shifts that have been happening that threaten the lives and well-being of trans people of color and others across the South. But I really hope people will check us out and stay tuned for that report.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Maria. I so appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. We're going to link all those good things that Carmen talked about in the show notes. I'm planning to release this on August 27th. So hopefully that's when you're listening to it, which means the report is now live. So you could go to that website Carmen mentioned earlier. It'll be in the show notes as well to check it out. And thank you again for joining us. Please continue the conversation, share this episode, look at our lovely faces on our YouTube channel. And until next time, that's it for today. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.